Anna Mae Florence was a woman of resilience and kindness, someone who had lived through hardship and found peace in her later years. At the age of 77, Anna Mae had recently moved from the rural life of Alabama to the city of Columbus, Ohio, hoping to enjoy her final years surrounded by family and a community that would offer her comfort. It was a new chapter, one filled with the warmth of neighbors who loved hearing her stories of a life that spanned decades, stories of hardship, perseverance, and love. Born on a small farm in Alabama, Anna Mae had known a life of hard work, but it was a life that shaped her character. She didn't have much, but she had a spirit that couldn't be broken. She lived through the loss of her husband and the solitude that followed. In her later years, she found herself alone, with no children to care for her. Her extended family decided to bring her to Columbus, hoping it would offer a better, safer life, where they could take care of her in a way her small Alabama town couldn't. Columbus became home to Anna Mae, a place where she found the companionship and peace she had longed for. She quickly became a beloved figure among her neighbors, known for her warm nature and captivating stories. For Anna Mae, this was the chance for happiness she had never known. Her days were spent enjoying the company of others, sharing her life experiences, and finding comfort in the newfound security of her home. But that sense of security was shattered on June 26, 1987, a day that began like any other but quickly turned into a nightmare. The details of that fateful day would haunt Anna Mae's family and her community forever. In an instant, everything she had worked for, everything she had built in her later years, was destroyed. That morning, a young woman appeared at Anna Mae's door. Posing as a charity worker, she asked for a donation, and Anna Mae, in her generous spirit, welcomed her in. What followed was a struggle, an act of violence that no one could have anticipated. In that moment, Anna Mae's kind heart, her willingness to open her door to a stranger, made her vulnerable, and the woman, who initially seemed harmless, took advantage of that vulnerability. The act escalated quickly, leading to a brutal confrontation that left Anna Mae stabbed in her own home, the place where she should have felt safest. Anna Mae's family arrived later that morning, only to find their worst fears confirmed. They saw a young woman fleeing the scene, covered in blood. They couldn't hold her, and by the time they entered the apartment, Anna Mae's life had been taken from her. The murder was senseless, brutal, and heartbreaking, a cruel end to a life that had been nothing but kind and full of love. Her family and the community were left to grapple with the loss. The case became a mystery, with no clear suspects, and slowly, the investigation went cold. For years, Anna Mae's murder haunted the memories of those who knew her, but the person responsible remained at large. This case, which seemed so ordinary at first, turned out to be anything but. Anna Mae's trusting nature, the kindness that made her beloved by all who knew her, had ultimately been her undoing. As the investigation unfolded, detectives and family alike struggled to understand how a simple act of charity could turn into a tragedy. For nearly 30 years, the family had no answers. But what they didn't know was that the path to justice was far from over. The murder of Anna Mae Florence sent shockwaves through her community. Her gentle nature, coupled with her recent relocation to Columbus, meant that few could fathom why anyone would want to harm her. Yet the crime was brutal, the kind that defies comprehension. What had started as an ordinary day for Anna Mae ended in unimaginable tragedy, leaving investigators and her family with more questions than answers. The police were quick to respond, arriving at Anna Mae's apartment on Delavan Drive just hours after the crime was discovered. The scene that greeted them was chilling. Anna Mae had been brutally stabbed multiple times in the chest. Her own kitchen knife turned against her in an act of viciousness that seemed completely at odds with the sweet woman known to her neighbors. The crime was shocking, and the brutality of the attack raised immediate suspicions. At first, the investigators had little to go on. There was no forced entry into the apartment, suggesting that Anna Mae had willingly opened the door to her attacker. What appeared to be a random act of violence slowly began to take shape as a robbery gone wrong, though there were discrepancies that didn't fully support that theory. Anna Mae's family had known her to be cautious with money. She rarely trusted banks and always kept her cash on her person, usually hidden in a money belt. However, when the police searched her apartment, they found that the money belt was missing, suggesting a robbery was indeed a motive. But there was something else that bothered the detectives: the way the crime unfolded. Anna Mae had not given up without a fight. Despite her age and frailty, she had struggled with her attacker, even managing to wound the young woman before succumbing to her injuries. This was no simple act of violence, it was a confrontation. The woman who had come to Anna Mae's door with an innocent request for a charity donation had become an intruder, violent and deadly. But why had the situation escalated so quickly? As the investigation continued, police began to piece together what little they knew about the attacker. Several neighbors later reported seeing the same young woman in the area, going door to door under the guise of raising money for charity. She appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, with a nondescript appearance that made her blend into the surroundings. The woman had made similar visits in the days prior to Anna Mae's murder, and many people assumed she was simply trying to drum up donations for a good cause. But now, in the wake of the murder, that assumption had turned into suspicion. The details from those who had interacted with the young woman were vague. She was always polite, never staying too long, and left no lasting impression on those she spoke to. For most, she was just another face in the crowd. But for Anna Mae, she was someone who had entered her home under false pretenses, someone whose true intentions were far darker than anyone could have imagined. Despite these early leads, the investigation soon ran into dead ends. The attacker had left few clues behind, and with no solid description to work with, the police were forced to rely on the testimony of witnesses who had only fleeting interactions with the woman. The lack of concrete evidence, combined with the difficulty in tracking down the woman, meant that the case soon grew cold. As weeks passed without significant progress, the sense of urgency among the investigators began to fade. The murder of a 77-year-old woman in her home was tragic, but there was no immediate suspect and no clear motive. The police pursued a few leads, including the possibility that the murder had been a targeted attack, or that the young woman might have been a part of a larger group involved in similar crimes. But without solid evidence or a suspect, the investigation stagnated. The case quickly slipped from the public eye. It was just another unsolved crime in a world full of them. For Anna Mae's family, the pain of losing their beloved matriarch was compounded by the knowledge that her killer was still out there. They had brought her to Columbus in the hopes of providing her with a safer, more comfortable life, but in the end, they were faced with the same cruel fate that had haunted her earlier years in Alabama: loneliness, fear, and now, grief. They clung to the hope that justice would one day be served, but with each passing year, that hope grew fainter. As the years went on, the memory of Anna Mae and the questions surrounding her death began to fade. Life went on for everyone but her family, who never stopped mourning the loss of the woman who had filled their lives with love and warmth. The cold case file gathered dust in the police department, and the name Anna Mae Florence became little more than a distant memory for most of the people who once knew her. But Anna Mae's family never gave up. They held on to the belief that one day, the truth would come to light. Though the world moved on, they continued to search for answers, determined to bring their loved one the justice she deserved. And in 2012, nearly 25 years after the brutal murder, their persistence would finally pay off. Years passed, and the murder of Anna Mae Florence seemed destined to remain one of many forgotten tragedies. But for her family, the pain never dulled. They continued to remember her kindness, her warmth, and the cruelty that took her life. The absence left a void that no amount of time could heal, and the uncertainty of who was responsible for her death was a burden they could not carry alone. They needed answers, justice, and closure. It was this unyielding desire for resolution that would eventually breathe life back into the case. In 2012, nearly 25 years after Anna Mae's murder, her niece, Rebecca, took a brave step. She contacted the authorities, urging them to reopen the investigation. She believed that advancements in forensic science, particularly in DNA technology, might provide the breakthrough that had eluded detectives for so long. She felt that they couldn't give up on Anna Mae's memory, that the truth could still be uncovered. At first, the idea of reopening the case seemed like a long shot. The passage of so many years had left investigators with little to work with. Most of the witnesses had moved away, and many of the neighbors who had once provided key information were no longer available. The young woman who had fled from the scene of the crime, Zena Robertson, was still an enigma. Her name had never come up in the original investigation, and there were no immediate leads that could be followed. However, the idea of applying new forensic methods and re-examining the evidence sparked a glimmer of hope. In January of 2013, the Columbus police decided to take Rebecca's request seriously and reopened the investigation into Anna Mae's murder. The cold case was now being approached with fresh eyes and the new tools available to modern investigators. One of the most significant advancements was the use of DNA evidence. With better preservation techniques and more refined methods of testing, detectives were able to revisit the physical evidence that had been collected from the crime scene, evidence that had been overlooked due to lack of resources when the murder first occurred. It was during this reinvestigation that a critical breakthrough occurred. The biological evidence previously untouched was retested and matched to a woman named Zena Robertson. This DNA match was the first significant lead in over 2 decades, and it confirmed what investigators had feared. The young woman who had posed as a charity worker and ended Anna Mae's life was now a suspect. Robertson's DNA had been found at the crime scene, and the piece of evidence that had gone untested in the original investigation had finally spoken, linking her directly to the murder. This discovery gave investigators renewed energy, but it also presented new challenges. Zena Robertson had been elusive for years, disappearing after the crime and leaving behind few clues as to her whereabouts. The investigation quickly shifted from reviewing old evidence to tracking down Robertson, who, in the years since the murder, had managed to live under the radar. For detectives, it felt like a race against time. Robertson had disappeared into the ether, and without a clear location or new identifying information, finding her would be no small feat. The police reached out to the remaining people who might remember Robertson, and they interviewed neighbors who had lived in the area in 1987. The few who still recalled the event vividly offered helpful details, but still, there was no guarantee that these new revelations would lead to her capture. Yet the pieces were starting to come together. It was clear that the authorities were closing in on Robertson, but the question remained, where was she now? After weeks of searching, they finally found the breakthrough they had been hoping for. Zena Robertson, now a grown woman, had been living quietly in Rome, Georgia, for nearly 2 decades. Her life had been unassuming. She had managed to blend into the small community, working odd jobs, living in a quiet apartment, and avoiding any real contact with law enforcement. Her criminal past had stayed buried, hidden behind a facade of normalcy. The only blip on her record was a minor shoplifting charge from 1999, followed by a probation violation in 2001, incidents that seemed insignificant compared to the brutal crime she had committed nearly 30 years earlier. For years, Robertson had lived in relative peace, evading the police, her violent past a distant memory, at least for her. Her neighbors knew her as a polite woman, but distant and somewhat reserved. They had no reason to suspect her of being involved in the murder that had haunted a community for decades. To them, she was just another quiet resident, nothing remarkable about her. But to the investigators now, she was the key to unlocking the long unsolved mystery of Anna Mae's death. In August 2013, after weeks of coordination between Columbus detectives and law enforcement in Georgia, Zena Robertson was tracked down. It was a sunny morning when police arrived at her place of employment, a small, nondescript takeout restaurant in Rome. At first, Robertson seemed unaware of the storm brewing just outside her door. As the officers approached her, she visibly tensed. Witnesses would later recall that she broke out in a cold sweat, though she didn't attempt to run or resist. The authorities moved quickly, and Zena Robertson was arrested on charges of aggravated murder. The quiet life she had led for so long came to an abrupt end. It was a surreal moment for everyone involved. After nearly 30 years, the woman responsible for Anna Mae's death had been found, and justice was finally within reach. For Anna Mae's family, the arrest was bittersweet. They had spent decades waiting for this moment, and though it brought them some comfort, it was not without its emotional toll. The years of unanswered questions, the years of grief, had all led to this point. While they were relieved that the mystery was over, it was impossible to erase the pain that had lingered in their hearts for so long. The family had been robbed of their beloved Anna Mae, and no amount of justice could undo the devastation they had endured. The day Zena Robertson's arrest was made marked a pivotal moment in a case that had gone cold for nearly 3 decades. It had taken years of persistence and careful investigation to track her down, but the authorities had finally caught up with the woman who had evaded justice for so long. The breakthrough came in August 2013, when detectives in Columbus, Ohio, alongside local law enforcement from Rome, Georgia, finally pinpointed Robertson's location. The woman who had committed a brutal murder and disappeared without a trace was now living an ordinary life in a small town, completely unaware that the past was about to catch up with her. It was early in the morning when a team of Columbus police officers, working in coordination with Georgia authorities, arrived at Zena Robertson's workplace, a modest takeout restaurant in Rome, Georgia. Robertson, who had lived quietly in the community for nearly 20 years, was no stranger to routine. She arrived for her shift just like any other day, unaware that her past was about to surface in the worst way possible. Witnesses who would later describe the scene mentioned that Robertson appeared visibly shaken when the police arrived, breaking into a sweat as she realized what was happening. Despite the shock, she did not resist arrest or attempt to flee. Authorities took Robertson into custody without incident. The woman who had spent years living under the radar was now facing the consequences of her violent past. Her quiet life in Georgia was about to end, and she would finally be held accountable for the murder of Anna Mae Florence. For Anna Mae's family, this moment was both a relief and a bitter reminder of the years they had lost. The pain of her absence would never truly go away, but the fact that justice was finally being served brought them a small measure of peace. The arrest shocked the quiet community of Rome. Robertson, who had spent years blending in and avoiding any legal trouble, had been living what seemed like an ordinary life. Her neighbors knew her as a polite, if somewhat distant woman. They had no idea about her violent past, and when news broke of her arrest, many were left in disbelief. The woman they had known as quiet and reserved was now facing charges for a brutal crime that had occurred decades earlier. The contrast between Robertson's current life and the shocking nature of the crime she had committed was jarring for those who had interacted with her. They couldn't reconcile the woman they had known with the violent figure now being taken into custody. The news of Robertson's capture spread quickly, bringing a sense of closure to those who had been affected by Anna Mae's murder. The long unsolved case, which had haunted Anna Mae's family and the community for so many years, was finally being solved. For the detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case, the arrest marked a bittersweet victory. The years of painstaking investigation had paid off, but the truth about what had happened to Anna Mae was far more devastating than they could have imagined. Robertson's arrest, while a triumph for law enforcement, was just the beginning of a long road to justice. While Anna Mae's family finally had a name to associate with the crime, they still had to face the emotional toll of the years spent grieving without knowing who was responsible for their loved one's death. As Zena Robertson was taken into custody, Anna Mae's family prepared themselves for the next phase of the long journey, the trial. The arrest of Zena Robertson was a pivotal moment in the nearly 30-year-long quest for justice for Anna Mae Florence. The woman who had lived a quiet life in Georgia, far removed from the crime she had committed, was now facing the consequences of her actions. But the path to justice wasn't complete yet. The trial would be the next step in holding Robertson accountable for the murder that had stolen Anna Mae's life in 1987. Zena Robertson was extradited back to Columbus, Ohio, where she faced charges for the brutal murder of Anna Mae. Her arrival at the Franklin County Courthouse brought with it a mix of emotions for Anna Mae's family. There was relief. Yes, finally, after all these years, a suspect had been found. But there was also an overwhelming sense of grief. Even though the truth was finally coming to light, the pain of losing Anna Mae could never be erased. The family had spent decades in the dark, and now they were confronted with the reality of what had been done to their beloved relative. Robertson's trial began with both sides presenting their cases. The prosecution outlined the grisly details of Anna Mae's murder, describing how the elderly woman had been viciously stabbed after opening her door to a stranger. The defense tried to argue that Robertson's actions were not premeditated, that she had been desperate and frightened during the confrontation. But the evidence was clear. Zena Robertson had killed Anna Mae in cold blood, after deceiving her into thinking she was a charity worker. Her crime had been one of violence and betrayal. The emotional weight of the trial was felt deeply by Anna Mae's family, who had spent nearly 3 decades wondering who had taken her life. They had been forced to live with the uncertainty of not knowing whether the killer would ever be caught. Throughout the trial, they listened as the details of the crime were revealed once again, and they were reminded of the years of grief that had followed Anna Mae's death. But it was also a chance for them to finally confront the person who had destroyed their family's peace. The turning point in the trial came when Zena Robertson, realizing the weight of the evidence against her, pleaded guilty to the murder charge. It was a surprising move that spared her family the anguish of a lengthy trial. In her plea, Robertson expressed regret for her actions, apologizing for the pain she had caused. "I am so sorry. I wish I could bring her back, but I can't," she said, her voice filled with emotion. The apology, though heartfelt, could not undo the years of hardship Anna Mae's family had endured. The judge, acknowledging the brutality of the crime, sentenced Robertson to 15 years to life in prison. It was a sentence that some felt was not enough to truly account for the gravity of the crime. Many in the courtroom felt that a life had been taken, and a harsher penalty should have been imposed. But the plea agreement, which avoided the possibility of the death penalty, brought an end to the legal battle. For Anna Mae's family, the sentencing offered a bittersweet form of closure. They were glad that justice had been served, but it did little to erase the void left by Anna Mae's murder. The 27 years of waiting, the unanswered questions, and the trauma of not knowing who had committed the crime had taken its toll. Still, they could now begin to honor Anna Mae's memory with a sense of finality. Robertson, now facing the rest of her life in prison, had to reconcile with the fact that her past had finally caught up with her. She had lived for years without consequences, but now she would face the full weight of her actions. While Robertson's time in hiding had come to an end, Anna Mae's family could at last begin to heal, knowing that the woman who had stolen their loved one's life was no longer a shadow hanging over them. In the years that followed, Anna Mae's community would continue to remember her not as a victim, but as the kind, loving woman whose life had been tragically cut short. For her family, the journey to justice had been long and painful, but it was a journey that ended with a sense of resolution. Zena Robertson's capture and sentencing marked the end of a long chapter of grief and uncertainty. The family could now begin to move forward, knowing that Anna Mae's memory would live on, not in sorrow, but in the justice she had been denied for so many years.